Well, hello dear comrades, and welcome to this new episode in our close readings of Tolstoy's What is Art. We continue today the discussion of true art. So last week we've gone through the characteristics of genuine art. We said that true art consists of infectiousness, that is, a real work of art infects the audience with the feelings felt by the artist with the intention to do so. We laid out three conditions for infection to take place: particularity, clarity, and sincerity. The higher these conditions are in terms of degree, the purer the art. Then we established that what makes good art isn't just, an art that conveys feelings, but conveys good feelings. What makes good feelings depends on the religious consciousness of a society at a certain period. That is the understanding of life's meaning, the ideal for that society. An art that conveys feelings that get us closer to that ideal is good, while those that get us away from, that ideal is considered bad art. So each nation and society has an art that it judges good and an art that it judges bad, but both are genuine art since they both convey feelings. Like good art and bad art are nonetheless, genuine art. However, as humanity progresses, the ideal set by religious consciousness evolves too. While nations usually restrict that ideal to just themselves while excluding others from it, the highest form of art would correspond to religious consciousness that sets an ideal, the union of all mankind. And such art is of two kinds. We said that there is religious art and universal art. The former promotes feelings that express the love of God and the love of one's neighbor, and the latter promotes feelings that are simple and accessible to all people, regardless of their language, belief, or backgrounds. So according to Tolstoy, only Christian art has reached that ultimate level, though he clarifies that true Christian art isn't church Christian art, which he regards as a cult. So that was, the things that we explored last week. And so that was the summary of chapter 15 and 16, which we covered last week. If you're just discovering the series and wonder how Tolstoy justifies this theory of art, you can watch the previous video for more details and how he concludes that Christian art is the highest form of art. You don't have to agree with it, of course. I myself don't agree with many things, in the book. But we're just here to learn from it and understand it. All right, then we now start reading chapter 17, and we will go up to chapter 19. And next week we finish the book with chapter 20, which serves as a conclusion. So chapter 17, what is it about? Well, this chapter is a digression because he brings back counterfeit art. Counterfeit art is the art of the upper classes, which we spent over half the book criticizing. So almost everything in this chapter is a restatement of points that we already covered. But if you are discovering the series with this episode, this can help you know what Tolstoy is on about and why he hates the kind of art that the upper classes love. And so why what he says, back then still applies to probably most works of art we have today, probably even what you consider art. So you might be thinking, I'm not a member of the upper classes, so this doesn't apply to the kind of art that I consume. But I invite you to think about that and see what Tolstoy has to say about counterfeit art. I'll let you decide whether you think that this applies to your taste or not. So a good way to look at this book isn't as a book on art, but a book on morality and also on class struggle. He started from an observable fact that art as produced in modern societies costs a lot of resources and notably a lot of human labor. So this isn't the labor put in the art itself, but the labor put in to create the conditions for artists to craft their art and art lovers to consume that art. It's about building infrastructure, theaters and wide stages, the material for publishing novels and poems, the art galleries for exhibiting, paintings, etc. So all of this requires the mobilization of millions of workers who most strangely are often absent from consuming the art that they themselves contribute to its very conditions and are living in extreme poverty, whereas artists, patrons, critics and audiences are thriving and living their best life of luxury. So Tolstoy asks if is this, worth it? Is art really that important? Like, this is the question of the book, and Tolstoy provides the definitive answer at the end of this chapter. And I think you can already guess what's his answer. But if the answer is yes, like it's worth it, then we have to know what art is to be able to judge if these sacrifices are indeed necessary. And when we look into it, we realize that all of this is done for the pleasure of the few elite classes. The kind of art that necessitates this labor is an art that defines itself as the manifestation of beauty, and more precisely, art that is the manifestation of some sort of aesthetic or sensory pleasure. Such an art excludes everyone who is not part of the elite circle that takes pleasure from that art, and therefore art becomes an ideological tool to assert even more the social hierarchies between the few elites and the many poor and exploited. So against this, Tolstoy raises this theory that art should be accessible to everyone, but for art to be accessible, it needs to be defined through another criterion, which is not beauty. So Tolstoy suggests infectiousness, and from there you get his theory of, why the highest form of art is an art that seeks the unity of all mankind, for such art is bound to be accessible to all. Alright, so that's a summary of what we saw last time. Now let's jump into the chapter. So it also starts with restating something that we've already covered, and that art isn't just a means for communication, but also one of the two means for human progress, or as Tolstoy puts it, art is one of the two organs of mankind's progress. So humans progress through communication. We saw that last time too. When we communicate, we come together, we unite, we understand each other, and even across generations, and so we can work collectively to improve our human existence. We have two organs, or two means, for that purpose. Organs here are a metaphor. So the first one is the word, and the second is the images of art. So he says, through the word, man communicates in thought. Through the images of art, he communicates in feeling with all people, not only of the present, but of the past and the future. It is proper for mankind to employ both of these organs of communication, and therefore the perversion of either one of them cannot fail to have harmful consequences for the society in which the perversion occurs. So Tolstoy says that for progress, you need both. You cannot say, for example, we can progress solely by communicating ideas. That's a terrible idea, by the way. Human beings cannot progress without also communicating feelings, because ideas on their own aren't enough to motivate people to unite. Only feelings can. And obviously, wanting people to progress without unity is basically calling upon the death of humanity. If you use only one, while the other you relocate to another function, you eventually pervert it, and that's what has been happening with art. Having been reappropriated by the upper classes, it's no longer used to convey feelings, but simply to please. And so, what are the consequences of this? Well, this is what the chapter is about. The consequences of counterfeit art, of the perversion of art. Well, the most obvious consequence is that progress is halted. But we need to understand this in detail. Well, we can start with overarching consequences. These harmful consequences are twofold. First, art disappears from the society or the social groups that replace art with counterfeits. It's the absence in that society of the activity which should be accomplished by the organ. Like there is no art anymore, since an art that simply manifests beauty and pleasure is not art, but an imitation or simulacra of art, a counterfeit. So there is no art anymore, and if there is no art anymore, there are no feelings being communicated, and so this leads us to the second point, the harmful activity of the corrupted organ. Like now that corrupted organ, its very activity, which was supposed to benefit and bring people together for human progress, now it harms society. First, it harms the upper classes themselves. Not that I care, but it's there. That the upper classes take on the monopoly of art doesn't mean that they are a united class, because the art that they produce is not art, and therefore they are not communicating feelings even to one another, even within their same group. So they have, in considerable measure, been deprived of the activity which this organ should have accomplished. So this is also due to the overproduction of counterfeits. The upper classes are not making counterfeits occasionally. No, they need a constant supply of the shit. So they need to consume art like addicts need to consume their drugs. They need a lot of it every day, which only accelerates their dependency rate and their loss of resilience. And so the upper classes have created two major issues for themselves. So he says, on the one hand, artistic counterfeits serving only for people's amusement and corruption have spread in our society on an enormous scale. So overproduction and overconsumption of counterfeits. And on the other hand, works of worthless, exclusive art valued as the highest art have perverted the capacity of the majority of people in our society, the upper classes here, for being infected by true works of art, and have therefore deprived them of the possibility of knowing the highest feelings to which mankind has attained and which can be conveyed to people only by art. So what's very alarming in relation to progress is that without the communication of feelings, religious consciousness fades away, meaning that eventually people can no longer maintain an understanding of life's meaning. Without it, they have no compass, no sense of direction, no indication pointing to where they should go. They have no ideal anymore to guide progress, to show progress the way it ought to lead. So they become incapable of even recognizing what is of high quality, what is a good feeling and a bad feeling, or even what makes a feeling, since the only criterion now is pleasure. They aren't able to recognize what is best or what is good, even in art, since they only follow pleasure. So they ignore, as Tolstoy says, all the best that mankind has produced in art, which remains foreign to people deprived of the capacity for being infected by art, and they praise false counterfeits of art or worthless art, which they mistake for genuine. Hence we know why people of our time and society admire the Baudelaires, the Verlaines, the Moreas, the Ibsens, the Metterlinks in poetry, the Monets, the Manets, the Puvis de Chavans, the Burne Joneses, the Stocks, the Böcklins in paintings, the Wagners, the Liszts, the Richard Strasses in music, etc., and are no longer capable of understanding either the highest or the simplest art. By the way, as always, I'm butchering the names. So thus their evolution is backward according to Tolstoy's. They don't, progress but regress. They return to perhaps the animalistic primal impulses. They, he says, not only do not move towards perfection, do not become better, but on the contrary, they become even more savage, coarse, and cruel. Hence, they start living as if in the jungle. They praise violence, power, might makes right mentalities. Hence, they're boner for patriotism, for wars and nationalism, hatred for the other, etc. They also praise sexual lust, anything that can distract them from how empty their world is. But it probably wouldn't be that alarming if they didn't gain that monopoly on art. The issue is that the upper classes establish themselves as the only ones who can make art, while the rest of society cannot. The masses are not smart enough, they don't have high and refined tastes, so they cannot possibly figure out what is even art. And so by doing so, even the masses start losing their capacity for producing art, but also recognizing true art. Because the upper classes aren't just making art for their small circles, but they are flooding the world with counterfeit works. And by doing so, the view that art should be a manifestation of beauty, a means for amusement, instead of infectiousness, becomes widespread beyond the close circles of elite classes. So now we're going to see how counterfeit art affects the society at large. So those are the overarching consequences. Genuine art disappears and society is actually harmed. Now we're going to look at that harm in detail. And here Tolstoy lists the consequences of the perverted activity of that organ that are still more harmful, and they are many. So he lists exactly 5 consequences. The first one concerns the working classes and children. as you remember, these counterfeits aren't really produced by the labor of the upper class artists. Their labor is already predicated on the labor of millions of workers to provide the infrastructure, material, instrument, publishing houses, etc. So there is the enormous waste of working people's labor on something not only useless, but for the most part harmful, and furthermore, the irredeemable waste of human lives on this needless and bad thing. Like, it's just, morally reprehensible how many lives are wasted on this. Looking at the living conditions of the working classes, their mortality rates, their long working days, the absence of health care for them, the poor hygiene of their homes, the malnutrition and the diseases to which they are constantly exposed, etc. So none of this is redeemable. As Tolstoy says, it is terrible to think with what effort, with what privations millions of people work, having no time or possibility to do necessary things for themselves and their families, spending 10, 12 or 14 hours a night typesetting pseudo-artistic books that spread depravity among people, or working for theaters, concerts, exhibitions, galleries, which mostly serve the same depravity. So, all of that labor that could have been, used in alleviating poverty, illiteracy, disease, hunger, homelessness, etc. All of it is wasted on an art that serves no purpose besides providing some elite few the pleasure to forget about their lonely, boring lives, and providing them with excuses to go colonize and hate their neighbors. And of course, this includes children too. There are kids of the working classes who also labor with their parents to provide for these things, but there are also the kids who are brought up to become artists. So we can say the children of the upper classes. Given that being an artist is a profession now, and we already had a whole discussion about why turning it into a profession is part of turning art into counterfeit in chapter 12. Well, kids must prepare themselves from their early age to become professional artists. And this Tolstoy hates, because these kids, who unlike the kids of workers have everything to have fulfilling childhoods, they see not only their young days wasted, but even their potential go to waste. As he complains, lively, nice children capable of all good devote themselves from an early age to spending 6, 8 or 10 hours a day for 10 or 15 years playing scales or twisting their limbs, walking on their toes and raising their legs above their heads, or singing solfeggios or declaiming verses with various affectations, or drawing busts, naked models, painting sketches, or writing compositions by the rules of certain periods. And that in these occupations, unworthy of human dignity, continuing often long after full maturity, they lose all physical and intellectual power and all understanding of life. People say it is terrible and pitiful to look at little acrobats putting their legs behind their necks, but it is no less pitiful to look at 10-year-old children giving concerts, and still more so to see 10-year-old children who know by heart the exceptions of Latin grammar. So in other words, kids are educated from a young age to turn into counterfeit producers, and in the most terrible conditions, so much so that they are physically and mentally crippled just for the sake of impressing their uppity families and circles. So they're basically being traumatized. And the harm doesn't just stop at the mental and the physical. Tolstoy also adds that they become crippled morally, becoming incapable of anything that is really necessary for people. Now, what does he mean by crippled morally? It means that they lose their ability to know what is good. That is, what must be done for the progress, by which we mean the unity of mankind. They become insensitive to loving thy neighbor, to human dignity, both for themselves and for others, as they're brought up into a milieu which uses privileges, prestige, wealth, and even knowledge as a social marker, as a tool to affirm their privileged position within the social hierarchy, as opposed to those socially inferior to them. They eventually put a higher value on securing such privileges than helping others. Thus, they pervert the activity of art. Instead of using it for sharing feelings and unite with others as equal, they use it to gain social power over others. And so they fall into that vicious circle of never having enough praises and flattery. He says, occupying in society the role of entertainers of the wealthy, they lose their sense of human dignity. They develop in themselves such a passion for public praise that they suffer permanently from unsatisfied vanity, inflated to a morbid degree in them, and they use all the powers of their soul to satisfy just this passion. And add to this, the most tragic trait of this first consequence of counterfeit art on the actual lives of people, on their life quality, is that these people, destroyed in order to live for art, not only are in no way useful to this art, but cause it the greatest harm. Like as counterfeit art harms them, they in turn harm genuine art, meaning that they make it even more difficult to be produced, given that they and more people like them are losing the ability to produce or recognize genuine art. In short, they are killing genuine art, just like we are killing a species to the brink of extinction. That's what institutions that claim to teach art are actually doing. He says, academies, schools, conservatories teach how to counterfeit art, and while being taught this, the kids become so perverted that they lose all ability to produce genuine art and become purveyors of that counterfeit or worthless or depraved art that fills our world. This is the first consequence of the perversion of the organ of art to strike the eye. So again, it's a vicious circle in which even the activity that can break them free from this hell, like genuine art, is being devalued and stifled more by the minute. So that's the first consequence of the harm that counterfeit art harmfully affects. It affects the lives of everyone, from workers to the upper classes to their children. And now moving on to the second consequence is the hypocrisy of the upper classes. Quote, the works of art amusement produced in such frightful quantities by the army of professional artists enable the wealthy people of our time to live a life that is not only unnatural but contrary to the principle of humanness professed by these same people. So the second consequence can have two meanings. The first one is if we understand humanness as in doing good by other beings, and that would actually follow from the previous one, and it mostly concerns the working classes. On the one hand, the upper classes constantly brag that they are more advanced than other classes and nations because they constantly appeal to the doctrine of human rights, to humanism, to philanthropy and all of that shit, the principle of humanness. Yet, no one in the history of humanity has probably a bloodier record of human rights violation than the European upper classes. And this is no coincidence, no contingency or accident. This is a contradiction built in within, the same ideology that allows there to be upper classes in the first place. So this is the contradiction. The lifestyle that they want to preserve is simply incompatible with such principles. The hierarchy that they wish to preserve, their privileges and social status, cannot coexist with the principle of humanness. And counterfeit art plays right into the contradiction. Their privileges can only be maintained if they cut themselves off from the rest of society. But by doing that, they alienate themselves from religious consciousness, since the smaller the group, the weaker the consciousness, and therefore they end up without an ideal. And Tolstoy is also going to emphasize that it's not just from the rest of society that they've, cut themselves off, but from nature too. Without the possibility of forming bonds with others, or even with the contact with nature, and add to this that they are upper classes, meaning that they don't even have challenges to stimulate them, they end up in complete atrophy. Thus, they require amusement all the time. They need luxury, extravagance, power, and lust. And their need for vanity only grows since their frustration constantly adapts to whatever you feed it. So they need more of that amusement. Problem is, since they are completely cut off from the rest of the world and even nature, they cannot sustain themselves. They cannot build their mansions or grow their luxurious food, their chandeliers, and more importantly, their art. So they need the working classes to provide it for them. And if they can't, Well, they just raise an army and go take the resources of neighboring nations. Plus, wars provide great entertainment for them. So, two birds with one stone. Hence the contradiction. So, to maintain their lifestyle, the majority must sacrifice theirs. And this, while preaching the principles of humanness. So, this is if we understand humanness in that way. And that's correct, although Tolstoy doesn't mention it. Instead, what he means by humanness is the fact of becoming human, of living fulfilling human lives and existence. Clearly, the upper classes aren't living human lives because a life of boredom and never-ending pleasure is that of an animal, and not even a free animal, but one raised in captivity. So this again is due to having cut themselves off from others and nature, precisely, the sources for humanity, or as Tolstoy calls it, the natural conditions of human life. And yet they keep claiming that their lifestyle of perpetual leisure is the best lifestyle ever and the most appropriate for human beings. But as Tolstoy says, to live as wealthy, idle people live, the woman especially, away from nature and from animals in artificial conditions, with muscles atrophied or abnormally developed by gymnastics, and with a weakened vital energy, would be impossible were it not for what is called art, were it not for the diversion, the amusement which turns these people's eyes from the meaninglessness of their lives and saves them from the boredom that oppresses them. Take from all these people the theaters, concerts, exhibitions, piano playings, ballads, novels, with which they occupy themselves in the conviction that this is a very refined, aesthetic, and therefore good occupation. Take from the Maecenases, so the wealthy patrons of art who buy paintings, patronize musicians, keep company with writers, their role as patrons of the important matter of art, and they will be unable to go on with life. They will all die of boredom, tedium, the awareness of the meaninglessness and lawlessness of their life. Only the occupation with what is considered art among them enables them, in violation of all natural conditions of life, to go on living without noticing the meaninglessness and cruelty of their life. And this supporting of the false life of the wealthy is the second and not insignificant consequence of the perversion of art. So I think it's clear. The second consequence is having to lead a life of hypocrisy. On the one hand, you claim that you promote human flourishing, yet not only that flourishing is only possible for a few elite, while the many must sacrifice their flourishing, but it's only flourishing as long as you have distractions, and so it's not even really flourishing. Their lives remain meaningless, and so their lifestyle is just a way to hide the fact that beneath it there's only boredom and emptiness. And that wraps it up for the second consequence. Its harm is out of the hypocrisy that results from it and in its obstruction to the concretization of humanness. Now we get to the third consequence of the perversion of art. It is the confusion it produces in the notions of children and the people. So counterfeit art impedes people's ability to know what is good, what should be praised. This ignorance is reinforced by the countless theories, each more confusing than the other, that pop up everywhere trying to define art, and yet none can provide a clear and simple account of what art is or how it ought to be evaluated. So this difficulty, however, doesn't appear in people who are not perverted by the false theories of our society, working people, children, and have a very definite idea of what one can be honored and praised for. So working people and children, those who aren't cut off from others and from nature, they have a natural resilience to such theories and don't actually need any theory in order to know what's true and good art. They are capable of recognizing it intuitively. You won't see them praising, the wrong things, as far as art is concerned, that is. And in that way, the understanding of simple people and children is more reliable than that of the most learned aestheticians. For example, according to them, and this will certainly, seem obvious to you, I hope, there are only two criteria, or the grounds for praising and glorifying people. We praise and glorify someone for either their physical strength, Hercules, mighty men, conquerors, or their moral, spiritual strength. So example of moral strength usually revolve around self-sacrifice and always doing what is good and right, even if it means putting their lives on the line and renouncing pleasure, especially that, for the sake of others' salvation or well-being. So Tolstoy mentions Shakyamuni, the Buddha, abandoning his beautiful wife and his kingdom in order to save men, or Christ going to the cross for the truth he professed, and all martyrs and saints. So Tolstoy argues that these two examples are both comprehensible to simple people and children. So they can intuitively see why someone who is strong physically and or morally ought to be praised. And they don't see any other reason besides these two to receive praise. You either praise someone because they are physically strong or because they are morally strong. And he explains this as follows. They understand that one cannot but respect physical strength because physical strength, makes itself respected. As for the moral strength of the good, as unspoiled man cannot but respect it because he is drawn to it by his entire spiritual being. Alright, so strength forces respect out of you apparently, and you are just drawn to moral goodness because your spiritual being responds to moral strength. So someone can say, well, what about intelligence? Why are these two the only criteria for praise? Well, I think that's because Tolstoy is going for things that are obvious, that everyone can see immediately just through visible deeds. These are for him, existentially evident. You don't need education, culture, or theory to recognize them. A child or a peasant can grasp them instantly. So his point is not these are the only human virtues. His point is these are the only ones that are universally intelligible without corruption. So physical strength is immediately visible and undeniable, you feel its force, and moral or spiritual strength is just universally compelling, like in self-sacrifice, always telling the truth, compassion, etc. Plus, you can argue that intelligence is not morally self-evident. It can serve domination, vanity, or deception, so it does not automatically command respect from workers and children. Like a clever manipulator is intelligent but not admirable. Plus, like we said, to recognize intelligence, you often need education, cultural codes, familiarity with disciplines like science, literature, etc. Whereas here, Tolstoy is idealizing a pre-cultural moral perception, what he calls the clarity of children and simple people. So intelligence doesn't qualify because it's not immediately legible across all humanity. So in short, not everyone can recognize intelligence or any other virtues besides physical strength. No one can fail to recognize it and praise it, and moral strength. So he's not saying nothing else besides these two virtues can be worthy of praise, period. He's saying that nothing besides these two can be praised immediately and intuitively before any cultural supplements. But other virtues can require, that we explain why they ought to be praised in order to praise them. Whenever we see someone getting praised for other virtues besides physical or moral strength, if we too praise them, that requires some sort of knowledge, some norms, codes, beliefs, etc. that we acquire from, our environment. So in short, we need an effort of an intellectual to understand what is to praise in it. So we can praise intelligence, but not intuitively. However, while there are things that can be praised, though not intuitively, but without, damaging our intuition, others are just contrary to our natural intuition. For example, it's undeniable that the highest virtue to praise is moral strength, right? The highest example of morality will always trump the highest example of intelligence, since intelligence for its own sake is neither good nor bad and can be used for bad things. So the highest things to praise are what contribute to our unity, to loving thy neighbor and treating others with care and compassion. So intelligence can never be more praised than moral strength. But if we find ourselves praising intelligence more than moral strength or moral goodness, there's clearly something wrong. And that is precisely it. In counterfeit art, we encourage people to praise things that are either unworthy of praise, or completely unworthy of praise, or if they deserve some praise, they are praised way beyond what they deserve, even trumping moral or physical strength. He says, and then these children and simple people suddenly see that besides those who are praised, honored, and rewarded for their physical or moral strength, there are also some who are praised, glorified, rewarded on an even greater scale than the heroes of strength and goodness, merely because they sing well, write poetry, are good dancers. They see that singers, writers, painters, dancers make millions, or aspire to do so, that they are giving greater honors than saints, and these simple people and children become perplexed. So you feel that something is wrong, that this isn't right. Rappers, pop and rock stars, and actors shouldn't be millionaires, especially when so many people are barely making over $1 a day. Tolstoy gives the following anecdote as an example of an artist who is getting incomprehensible praises: Alexander Pushkin. So Russia's most celebrated playwright, poet, and novelist. So Pushkin died in 1837. He was young, just 37 years old, and he died in a duel. And it's actually a funny story because he was killed by a French military officer serving in Russian cavalry guard regiment, and his name was Georges-Charles Dantes, who apparently was having an affair with Pushkin's wife Natalia, even though he was married to her sister. So Pushkin challenged him to a duel, and he got fatally wounded in the stomach and died 2 days later. So 50 years after the event, Tolstoy says, cheap editions of his works were published and spread among the people, and a monument was erected to him at the same time in Moscow. It was in 1880. I received more than 10 letters from different peasants. These are people who don't know, who Pushkin was. They just heard that a massive monument was, being erected for him. So they were asking Tolstoy why Pushkin was so glorified. Just the other day, I was visited by a literate tradesman from Saratov. Literate simply means someone who can read and write, not who can write correctly, by the way. So he was visited by a literate tradesman who had apparently lost his mind over this question and was going to Moscow to expose the clergy for having contributed to the erecting of the monument to Mr. Pushkin. Like, imagine peasants or the working class who never heard of your favorite artists and suddenly hear how rich they are, how many memorials were done for them, that they have, their names on the Hall of Fame, etc. So he continues, in fact, one need only imagine the situation of such a man of the people when he learns from the newspapers and rumors that reach him that the clergy, the authorities, all the best people in Russia have triumphantly unveiled a memorial to the great man, the benefactor, the glory of Russia, Pushkin, of whom he has hitherto heard nothing. He reads or hears about it from all sides and thinks that if such honors are rendered a man, the man probably did something extraordinary, either of strength or of goodness. Since the intuitive virtues are the highest ones to receive praises, if a man receives more praises than saints usually receive, this has to be an extraordinary deed. Of either physical or moral strength. So he tries to find out who Pushkin was, and having found out that Pushkin was not a mighty man or a military leader, but was a private person, a writer, he concludes that Pushkin must have been a holy man and teacher of the good, and he hastens to read or hear about his life and writings. But how great must be his perplexity when he learns that Pushkin was a man of worse than light morals, that he died in a duel, that is, while attempting to murder another man, and that his entire merit consists merely in having written poems about love, often quite indecent ones. that some mighty men as Alexander of Macedon, Genghis Khan, or Napoleon were great he can understand, because any of them could crush him and thousands like him. And he also can understand that Buddha, Socrates, and Christ are great, because he knows and feels that he and all people ought to be like them. But why a person should be great because he wrote poems about the love of woman? That he cannot understand. The same must go on in the head of a Breton or Norman, a Norman peasant, who learns of the setting up of a memorial, une statue, as if to the Mother of God, to Baudelaire, when he reads or is told of the contents of Les Fleurs du Mal. Or still more amazing, to Verlaine, when he learns of the pathetic, depraved life the man led and reads his poetry. And what confusion must occur in the heads of simple people when they learn that some Patti or Taglioni, the former was an Italian singer playing in the operas of Mozart, Rossini and Verdi, and the latter was a celebrated dancer. So that some Patti or Taglioni is paid 100,000 per season, that a painter gets as much for a picture, and that the authors of novels describing love scenes get even more. The same also happens with children. I remember experiencing this astonishment and perplexity myself, and becoming reconciled with this extolling of artists on a par with mighty men and moral heroes only by lowering in my consciousness the significance of moral worth and accepting the false, unnatural significance of works of art. The same thing happens in the soul of every child or simple person when he learns of the stage honors and rewards rendered to artists. This is the third consequence of our society's false attitude towards art. So that's the consequence. People, because of counterfeit art, seeing how much praises it gets, start altering even unconsciously the significance that they give to moral strength, slowly lowering it, until the vain pleasures they get from indecent poems end up celebrated, while poems that promote moral contents of, saints, great heroes, and moral men are almost extinct. In other words, it perverts us into valuing the wrong things, and therefore it destroys our intuitive and natural sense of artistic perception. And for those who maintain their sense unscathed, they just grow confused because nothing makes sense anymore. How can Pushkin, Baudelaire, and Verlaine be this praised for having done nothing but write mediocre poems? Shouldn't people be praised for their strength and moral virtue? This doesn't make any sense. But concerning those whose sense has been perverted, this gets us to the fourth consequence. Of course, the praises aren't enough to actually pervert the taste of the masses yet. Give it another 100 years, Tolstoy, and you just listen to Cardi B. So, fourth consequence now is of such an attitude is that people of the upper classes, as they encounter more and more frequently the contradiction between beauty and the good, place the ideal of beauty higher, thereby freeing themselves from the demands of morality. So yeah, what matters for the upper classes and their aestheticians is just beauty and pleasure, which run completely contrary to what simple folks, working classes and children, value, as we've just seen. But even more tragically, they're not even capable of recognizing that their art isn't art at all. They can't recognize, as he says, the art they serve for what it is, that is, as a backward thing. And they even go as far as perverting the roles and recognize morality as a backward thing which can have no importance for people of a high degree of development, such as they fancy themselves to be. So in other words, having put beauty and pleasure as the highest good, for them morality doesn't matter that much, or that it just doesn't exist. That's a superstition. And so they regard art as having to serve what they consider the most valuable thing, meaning beauty and pleasure. So this is what Tolstoy calls the wrong attitude towards art. And although it was manifest in Tolstoy's circles, the upper classes, for a long time, it gained a greater fellowship and unrestricted expression, with particular insolence, as he says, with the arrival of its prophet Nietzsche and his followers, as well as the decadents and English aesthetes identical with them. So aesthetes are people who live solely for sensory experience and pleasure. You can say, they are the parody of hedonism. Tolstoy mentions Oscar Wilde as an example, who chooses as the theme of their works the denial of morality and the praise of depravity. Now I have to say that the way Tolstoy lumps these names together can be misleading, because while Nietzsche rejects morality and is appalled by any theory of art that prescribes any moral content to art, he also doesn't value beauty, and certainly not pleasure. Instead, he wants art to manifest the will of power. He wants it to manifest grandeur, conquest, the Übermensch, who's not limited by neither morality nor beauty, and who embraces pain and suffering as essential parts of life. Although Tolstoy would still argue that Nietzschean aesthetics, both pre and post Birth of Tragedy, are still embedded in the same tradition of the upper classes. That is, it's about the artist's inner state of being than about, a social relation with others in which you share your feelings. But you can even say, doesn't that also align with the virtue of physical strength? And doesn't it conflict with the virtue of moral strength? Sure, but we, brought those virtues in a different context. It was about what people can understand to praise intuitively. Not that they should praise whatever they can understand, why it's praised without effort. So, although, both are intuitive, they are not equally valued. As we said, morality should be the highest value. Plus, we are talking about art here specifically. And yes, art can manifest both physical strength and moral strength. Many great stories that are genuine art are about, the physical strength of its characters and promote power and conquest. However, we are looking for what is to be considered good art according to the religious consciousness of the time, that is, true Christian art. And as such, while both can make genuine art, only art that moves us for its moral content can be considered good, while art that moves us because of its display of strength is bad art. It certainly can be good art for the ancient Greeks, but then it would be good for a religious consciousness that is morally inferior to that of Christians, because it's not looking for the unity of mankind. Plus, it's important to remind you that in Nietzsche's case, he didn't consider real and good art accessible to the masses. So even if he is more on the side of physical strength, the fact that he sees that art is elitist means that it is alienated from that intuition. So even kids, workers, and peasants who respond to physical strength won't be able to feel anything in front of Nietzschean art. So again, even if Nietzsche cannot be classified as an aesthetician of pleasure and beauty, and certainly looks down at those who see art as just means for leading depraved lives, he still fits within that tradition. But perhaps the aesthetician who manifests most this tradition is Ragnar Redbeard. So his philosophical teachings correspond to decadent art, according to Tolstoy. He got from America a book titled The Survival of the Fittest, Philosophy of Power by Redhead in 1896. And from the title you can guess what it's about. It is Nietzsche meets Spencer. And Tolstoy writes, "The essence of this book, as expressed in the publisher's preface, is that to evaluate the good by the false philosophy of Hebrew prophets and weeping messiahs is madness. Right results not from any teaching, but from power. All laws, commandments, and teachings about not doing to others what you do not want done to yourself inherently means nothing, and acquire meaning only from cudgel, prison, and sword. A truly free person is not obliged to obey any injunctions, human or divine. Obedience is the sign of degeneracy, disobedience is the sign of the hero. People should not be bound by traditions invented by their enemies. The whole world is a slippery battlefield. Ideal justice consists in the vanquished being exploited, tormented, and despised. The free and brave can conquer the whole world, and therefore there should be eternal war for life, for land, for love, for women, for power, for gold. Something similar was voiced several years ago by the famous and refined academician Vogel. The earth with its treasures is the booty of the bold. So this means that the words wealth and opportunities belong to those who are courageous, aggressive, and willing to take the risks. So Vogel, that's Eugène Melchior Vicomte de Vogel, he was a member of l'Académie Française, and he wrote a study of the Russian novel which introduced the French to 19th century Russian writers. Now, what is funny about him is that he belonged to the neo-Christian movement inspired by Tolstoy and Dostoevsky in reaction to naturalism in literature and scientism in philosophy. So he shouldn't endorse that power bullshit and should be criticizing it. But Vogel is actually endorsing that doctrine of power and even considers violence to be a natural and divine law, that war is necessary and even beneficial. And this is another case of that hypocrisy within the upper classes. Even those who are sympathetic to love thy neighbor still consider it too idealistic, not realistic, and too naive. As for Redbeard, Tolstoy says that obviously, on his own, independently of Nietzsche, he has come to the same conclusions that are professed by modern artists. So I think, the teachings are clear. Nothing matters but power. And that power is now what is to be valued and praised, which isn't even physical force, by the way. Power is dominance, whereas strength is just a brute force that doesn't, prescribe anything. The strong isn't the powerful who dominates others. Strong people are, of course, needed when they put their strength in the service of morality, it is good. But when they put it for the service of evil, that's power. And so Nietzsche, of course, would repudiate this, seeing it as a way for the weak to rob the strong and the powerful. His, opportunities to rob him of his opportunities to do great things. Progress for Nietzscheans comes when morality is abandoned because progress is done by the great Superman who cares less about morality. Morality is a liability. It holds progress back. As for Tolstoy, these principles are not alien to beauty, but are contained in the ideal of art that serves beauty. So Nietzsche didn't reject beauty, he simply redefined it while pretending not to care about it. Instead of harmony, right proportions, and symmetry like in classical art, Nietzsche calls in extravagance, chaos, power. And this is still a worldview embedded in the notion of beauty. Beauty is now whatever the Superman does, unrestricted by morality. So he says, the art of our upper classes has cultivated in people this ideal of the Superman, which in fact is the old ideal of Nero, of Razin, of Genghis Khan, Robert Macaire, Napoleon, and all of their accomplices, satellites, means parasites, and flatterers, and maintains it in them with all its might. So some of them are probably unknown to you, besides Nero, the batshit crazy Roman emperor, Genghis Khan, and Napoleon. But it's weird that he includes Stenka Razin. He was a 17th century Don Cossack who became a popular hero by leading a peasant uprising in 1667 to 70. But maybe he was included because his rebellion stemmed from a hatred of the governing classes who hanged his brother for a breach of military discipline. But still, he formed a robber band and led a rebellion, declaring himself in favor of freedom of the serfs, religious tolerance, and the abolition of taxes. But his tactics were still like the government he opposes. He relied on force, and though he used it largely in defense of the poor against the rich, like Robin Hood, he believed that ultimately it's power that matters. Like the poor after rebellion must seek to impose power. And as for Robert Macaire, he's a fictional character from the melodrama L'Auberge des Adrets, and he is a modern type of a rascal, a trickster, swindler, and criminal, often portrayed as a charming con man or financial schemer. So he's a symbol of greed, fraud, and corruption. So all of these figures, according to the might makes right doctrine, They all live according to the might makes right doctrine, which is the logical consequence of the ideal of beauty. So the consequence of counterfeit art then is that it signals that the highest ideal isn't morality, but beauty and ultimately power. So he says, this supplanting of the ideal of morality by the ideal of the beautiful, that is, of pleasure, is the fourth consequence, and a terrible one, of the perversion of art in our society. It is frightening to think of what would happen to mankind if such art were to spread among the popular masses, and it is already beginning to do so. Alright then, so now we move to the fifth and final consequence, which is the chiefest, and that is, the art which flourishes in the milieu of the upper classes of European society directly corrupts people by infecting them with the worst and humanly most harmful feelings of the superstition of patriotism and chiefly of sensuality. Okay, so some can find it weird because he says that upper class art infects men with the worst feelings. That is weird. That's a weird way to put it because up until now we were under the impression that counterfeits don't infect with feelings. They just call in you base animalistic drives, impulses, or emotions, like just physiological reactions, but not feelings. And I thought that for infection to occur, you need the artist to feel those feelings too, that they are sincere, you know. But upper class artists aren't sincere, so they cannot convey feelings, so they cannot infect you with feelings. And even the wording is strange. It says, feelings of the superstition of patriotism. So I checked with Maude's translation and the French translation, and it's actually feelings of superstition, of patriotism and sensuality. I mean, patriotism is a feeling. I can conceive that, you know, sensuality as a feeling. Well, not really. It's more of a sensation or an emotion if you take emotion to be just physiological reactions, like it's just arousal. And superstitions, well, how is that a feeling? I mean, you can argue that feelings maintain superstitions, but to say that superstitions are feelings, that's weird. Like, it's weird. That passage is weird. But I don't think it matters that much, because if you boil it down, it says that the art of the upper classes just affects us in a harmful way, like it encourages superstition, patriotism, so hatred towards others, and sexual arousal, like pornography is an upper class art. Whether we take them as feelings or not doesn't really matter. It's if they are not feelings, well, it's counterfeit, and if they are, then all right, we can say it's genuine art since there is infection, while supposing that the artist is sincere, but it is bad art. And it's like bad on a whole other level, because you cannot get more isolated, fractured people than, you know, this with this shit. Like, nothing can be more detrimental to unity among people than superstition, patriotism, and sexual lust for some reason. But let's just grant that. So he's going to develop each of these points. So whether art or not, whether feelings or not, the point is art of the upper classes contributes to the disunity of people. So even when it tries to unite them under patriotism, it unites through an opposition to an hatred of the other. And but he's going to explain, you know, what he means by that. So let's see what Tolstoy has to say about each one of these feelings. First, he makes a critique of modernity. That is, he points to the irony of how never before in the history of mankind did we have this many schools and libraries, and yet never before were we as ignorant as we are now. Ignorance didn't go away despite that more and more people are getting educated. And that's because, as Tolstoy says, the root causes of ignorance in the popular masses are by no means the lack of schools and libraries as we are accustomed to think, but superstitions. So if ignorance is just a matter of not having certain information, then by increasing the number of libraries and access to education, that should solve the issue. But that's a mistake, for ignorance isn't a lack of information, but a superstition. And superstition doesn't go away by reading books, because what maintains it are feelings, like we said. If someone feels a certain way, you can make them feel hatred towards a specific group of people, no matter what information you give about those people. You know, that hatred won't go away. At least not thanks to the information alone. Like, how could the church maintain the superstition of the Trinity, the miracles, the resurrection, etc., if it weren't for its art? If it weren't for the feelings that it keeps pouring into people's hearts, it wouldn't be able to maintain those superstitions. Now that the upper classes have abandoned church Christianity, as we said, and that the church lost its grip and power, superstition had to be maintained by changing its content. It's no longer hatred of heretics and fear of hell and of the unknown that motivates superstition, but patriotic sentiments. Superstitions then, churchly as well as patriotic, with which the popular masses are imbued, are constantly being generated by all the resources of art. So here's the parallel between the two. For church superstitions, by the poetry of prayers, hymns, the painting of icons, the sculpting of statues, by singing, organs, music, and architecture, and even by dramatic art in church services. For patriotic superstitions, by verses, by stories told even in schools, by music, singing, solemn processions, royal entrances, military paintings, and memorials. So in both cases, you have indoctrination. We make you believe that there is something almost supernatural about your country, and by extension, your government and the ruling classes, that it is, natural to have those and love those who look like you, while hating those who don't, and who are often victims. So national novels and hymns, all of that is to create an emotional attachment to an ideal that doesn't correspond to the religious consciousness of true Christianity, meaning the unity of mankind. And therefore, it simply promotes disunity and hostility between men and holds back true progress, which the true enlightenment of the masses consists of. So he says, if it were not for the constant activity of all branches of art in maintaining churchly and patriotic stupefaction and embitterment among the people, the popular masses would long ago have attained the true enlightenment. But it is not only churchly and patriotic corruption that art accomplishes. So already patriotism is only possible if we keep the masses in superstition, which is maybe, what the translator meant by feelings of the superstitions of patriotism, like the feelings that promote patriotic superstition. Then comes the other point, sex. So he starts big. Quote, in our time, art also serves as the main cause of people's corruption in the most important question of social life, sexual relations. So let's see what Tolstoy thinks of sexual relations. So he views it as the cause of endless suffering and useless waste of energy. Like when you see how much energy and efforts are put for the sake of sexual desires, energy that, like the labor of millions of workers, could have spent on fostering unity between people, you have to agree that much of it was wasted for nothing. That even the intercourse wasn't even that good. In short, sex is so overrated and has undoubtedly caused more harm than good. So he says, we all know from our own selves, and fathers and mothers also know from their children, what terrible spiritual and bodily sufferings, what a useless waste of energy people experience only because of the licentiousness of sexual lust. Since the world began, since the time of the Trojan War, which was started because of sexual licentiousness, and down to the suicides and murders on account of love reported in almost every day's newspaper, a great share of mankind's suffering has been caused by this licentiousness. So yes, people who commit suicide because of love, they were just sublimating their sexual lust. There's nothing noble about killing yourself over love, because no love warrants suicides. Love instead is about self-sacrifice for the sake of the unity of mankind, not to play Romeo and Juliet. And yet despite that, despite the fact that it's not worth it so much artistic effort is put into the celebration of sexual lust. He says, all art, both genuine and counterfeit, with the rarest exceptions, is devoted solely to describing, portraying, arousing all sorts of sexual love in all its forms. One has only to recall all the novels with lust inciting descriptions of love, most refined ones and most crude ones with which the literature of our society is filled, all those paintings and statues portraying the naked female body and all sorts of nastiness that passes into illustrations and advertisements, only to recall all the vile operas, operettas, songs, ballads with which our world teems. And one involuntarily thinks that existing art has only one definite aim, the wide possible spreading of depravity. So the problem is that sexual lust makes you less capable of resisting pleasure to the point where in the quest to have it, we cause such pain and suffering that isn't worth it. So we become completely blind to the well-being of others for the sake of sexual arousal. It increases competition among men and it fuels the desire to dominate, often hidden under simping, like nothing can distract you more from the demands of morality than sexual pleasure. So that's the last consequence. It reinforces superstitions, fills us up with hatred, and makes us care only about our own pleasure to the extent of causing tremendous suffering, just for that minor benefit. So he says, what is called art in our society not only doesn't contribute to mankind's movement forward, but perhaps more than anything else hinders the realization of the good in our life. And with this, we can end this chapter and answer that ultimate question, given the consequences of counterfeit art or even bad art in the context of true Christianity, are the sacrifices offered for art worth it? I mean, we all know what Tolstoy is going to say, but let's read the paragraph anyway. So he says, and therefore, the question involuntarily asked by any man who is free from artistic activity and therefore not bound to existing art by any self-interest, the question I put at the beginning of this writing, whether it is just that such sacrifices be offered to what we call art, which belongs to only a small part of society, sacrifices in human labor and in human lives, receives its natural answer, no. It is not just, and it should not be so. This is the answer of common sense and of unperverted moral instinct. Not only should it not be so, not only should no sacrifices be offered to that which is recognized as art among us, but on the contrary, all the efforts of people who wish to live a good life should be directed towards destroying this art, because it is one of the cruelest evils oppressing our mankind. So that if the question were put as to which would be better for our Christian world, to lose all that is now regarded as art, including all that is good in it, together with false art, or to continue to encourage or allow the art that exists now, I think that any reasonable and moral person would again decide the question the way it was decided by Plato for his Republic and by all church Christian and Mohammedan teachers of mankind, that is Muslims, we would say, better that there be no art than the depraved art or simulacrum of it which exists now should continue. Fortunately, no one is faced with this question, and no one has to decide it one way or the other. All that men can do, or that we so-called educated people who are in a position to be able to understand the meaning of the phenomena of our life can and must do, is understand the delusion we are in and not persist in it, but seek to get out of it. So there you go. Now the answer is no, it's not worth it, and it's so not worth it that if we have to choose between no art at all, like banishing all forms of art, and counterfeit art, the choice should be easy. No art at all is better than counterfeit art. So now we get to chapter 18, and it brings the true purpose of art to the brotherly union of men, which is what true Christianity is all about, and it is the purpose of human life. The upper classes, however, have clearly adopted a lifestyle that denies such purpose by the simple fact that there still exist upper classes. The union of mankind isn't here yet, obviously. So given that the upper classes aren't working for the progress of humanity, that is towards unity, then they must believe that the purpose of human life is something else. And so they take art to be the reflection of whatever purpose they falsely believe to be the purpose of human life. And we've already addressed the causes of that falsehood, but we can go through them again. So the root cause was that the upper class people, having lost faith in the truths of the so-called Christian teaching of the church, did not dare to accept true Christianity in its real and chief meaning, as sonship to God and the brotherhood of men, and went on living without any faith, trying to make up for the absence of faith, some by hypocrisy, pretending that they still believed in the absurdities of church faith, others by the bold proclamation of their unbelief, others by refined skepticism, and still others by a return to the Greek worship of beauty, acknowledging the legitimacy of egoism and elevating it into a religious teaching. So Tolstoy points to 4 ways the upper classes make up for the absence of faith. You remember that discussion from chapter 6, that in the late Middle Ages, upper classes dissatisfied with church Christianity found themselves in a dilemma about what to do regarding faith. So they can either return to church Christianity, but they don't seem to express any desire to do so, or embrace true Christianity based on the teachings of Jesus. That is the sonship to God, and like we are all brothers and sisters because we are God's children, and so the brotherhood of men. So neither alternative was appealing to the upper classes, especially true Christianity, since the brotherhood of men is incompatible with the existence of upper classes. It is incompatible with class division. And so we all know how the upper classes like their privileges. So refusing both, they were left in a state of faithlessness, and so they came up with 4 ways to cope with that absence of faith. Some kept pretending to endorse church Christianity, but without believing in any of it. Others went full-on atheists or agnostics, and others embraced some sort of neo-paganism. They revived ancient gods, or more precisely, ancient views, notably the worship of beauty from the classical world, and with that, they began openly championing individualism and egoism, where religious demands of morality, altruism, self-sacrifice, etc. were losing momentum. And now the way Tolstoy focuses on in this book is the 4th way, the 4th one, the celebration of beauty over morality. That according to him is a pagan value system. And this while acknowledging that the great philosophers, notably Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, were critical to that fascination with beauty and didn't go as far as regarding the former replacing the latter. But this is where we are now. We are living in a world in which beauty is most celebrated while morality is either absent or distrusted as a superstition. Which is ironic, given that nothing is more superstitious than a worldview in which beauty is the highest good. So where do we go from there? Well, if, as he says, the cause of the disease was the non-acceptance of Christ's teaching in its true, that is, its full meaning, then the cure of the disease lies in one thing only, the acknowledgement of this teaching in all its meaning. So acknowledge that the purpose of life is the unity of mankind, an acknowledgement that is not only possible in our time but also necessary. It is imperative that we acknowledge that because that falsehood is having unacceptable consequences on our actual lives. And the reason why Tolstoy says that we must, it's because in our time, that's the only rational way to live. A rational way to live is living according to the religious consciousness of the time, meaning with the highest possible understanding of human life the best men of a certain time and place could come up with. Back in ancient Greece, religious consciousness was that expressed by the most advanced of men in terms of morality, since that's more advanced towards greater unity than the views of others who are too fascinated with beauty. Socrates and Plato were more advanced than Homer and Sophocles, for example, and therefore they presented a worldview, an ideal, an understanding of life's meaning that is more inclusive, more moral, and therefore implies greater unity. So that's the religious consciousness of their time. But once that progress occurs, once religious consciousness evolves, it cannot regress into an inferior state, especially when the knowledge that refutes that inferior state has become established and widely accessible. Like, it's possible for true Christianity at the time of Jesus to then regress into an inferior form, church Christianity, which perverted the teachings of the Gospels by incorporating in it pagan elements. But that's because true knowledge, as in correct knowledge about the natural world and metaphysics, was still almost inexistent. People still believed in all kinds of shit, and so it is no coincidence that the church's loss of power coincided with the scientific revolution. So the upper classes further justify their isolation from church Christianity by the scientific refutation of miracles, for example. And so now that science has evolved and has refuted countless claims and dogmas held by the church, it's impossible to go back to church Christianity. So regress here is no longer possible, at least on the level of knowledge. But even on a moral level, regression is no longer possible, at least consistently. There is no turning back to ideals that glorify power, military conquest, and domination after the messages of Christ. For Tolstoy, Jesus' insights, especially his Sermon on the Mount, cannot be ignored. We cannot live, while ignoring it. So we cannot not live by it. We cannot ignore what he said about the meek and the poor, about loving your neighbor, and especially about non-violence. That, for Tolstoy, is the greatest progress in terms of morality, and ignoring it, thinking that there can be another system of moral values besides that of Jesus and wanting to go back to such a system, is like wanting to return to primitive science. Plus, in the 19th century, with what is seen, in terms of poverty, and with the knowledge that it is all man-made and it is possible to live in a poverty-free world, we cannot just turn our heads and pretend that we don't see the sufferings of so many people and deny that such poverty is imposed by us, by our political and moral choices. So when you know that things are bad and it is in our capacity to make them better, then we must make them better. So now that we know that humanity only progresses by universal unity, and that unity is possible, then it's a moral obligation to bring about that unity. And even more importantly, the fact that the working masses, the workers and the peasants, as well as children, respond naturally to the messages of Christ, he takes it as proof that it is the religious consciousness of the time, and so, whether we like it or not, it is the framework that we must follow. And with the advances of communication technologies, the media, mostly printing at the time, the messages of Christ are available to everyone. Every household can easily have a Bible and read scripture. So there is no going back, and no attempts at suppressing religious consciousness can work. You cannot steer religious consciousness according to your desires and belief, but it steers you. It guides your path, the path of humanity. And therefore, in this day and age, we can no longer neither afford, as Tolstoy says, for a man who has come up to the level of knowledge in our time, whether he be a Catholic or a Protestant, to say that he believes in the dogmas of the Church, in God as Trinity, in Christ as divinity, in the redemption and so on, and it is no longer possible for him to be satisfied by the proclaiming of unbelief, skepticism, or a return to egoism and the worship of beauty, and above all, it is no longer possible to say that we do not know the true meaning of Christ's teaching. The meaning of this teaching has not only become accessible to all people of our time, but all human life in our time is pervaded by the spirit of this teaching, and consciously or unconsciously is guided by it. So Tolstoy is now making a teleological claim, like there is a destiny of man to be accomplished. That is the point of religious consciousness. And sure, you can say that the people of the Christian world had different definitions of that destiny. They may all agree that the journey of being a Christian is to arrive at the light, but what the light actually is and how exactly we get to it, that's a matter of dispute. They can recognize, as he says, the progress of mankind in whatever sense they want, as the uniting of all people into a socialist state or commune, as a world federation, as union with a fantastic Christ, or the union of mankind under the guidance of one church. So, but despite this diversity of definitions of what the destiny of human life must be, there are two things that they cannot disagree on. All people of our time recognize that one, the destiny of man is the good, and second, the highest good in life accessible to people of our world is attained in their uniting together. So in other words, everyone must accept, as all Christians, or at least true Christians who understand the message of Christ do, that there is a destiny of human life, and that destiny is good, so we should embrace it, dedicate our life to it, and accomplish it, and that destiny is the uniting of all mankind. One way or another, each Christian agrees that the unity is essential and is coming. Whatever form it may take, it is coming because it is humanity's destiny. And this, the upper classes cannot, or they refuse to accept. I mean, they can speak of a unity in an abstract sense. They've been doing that for the past 300 years with their universal human and natural inalienable rights, which they never miss an opportunity to violate whenever their economic and class interests are threatened. But that's the hypocrisy that Tolstoy was exposing throughout the book. And so that doesn't count. We are talking about people who actually believe in such unity, and so who at least define it as a classless society, whatever form it may take. We cannot be united if some of us have political power over others, and given that any division of class leads to political power imbalances, a unity of mankind, so a united mankind, is incompatible with class division, whether in a socialist state or a world republic, a federation of nations, etc. But of course, the upper class people, he says, sensing that their significance is based on their separating themselves as wealthy and learned from working people, the poor and unlearned, they will resist and try to invent new worldviews which might enable them to keep their advantages, whether it be the ideal of a return to the old days, or of mysticism, Hellenism, or supermanhood. So Hellenism, as an ideology of the upper classes, is the belief in the supremacy of Greek culture, and supermanhood is the belief that there are men who are greater than others and should dominate those who cannot ascend to supermanhood. You can also add capitalism as an ideological system that tries to justify class division on the pretext that such disparities are somehow more beneficial to society as a whole than equality. But no matter how hard they try and how many theories they try to come up with, how many worldviews, desperately, trying to justify the supremacy of their class, they must recognize, whether they will or not, the truth that affirms itself on all sides in life, consciously or unconsciously, that our good lies only in the union and brotherhood of men. So there is no stopping progress, according to Tolstoy, and this is something that we need to agree on. Progress is the establishing of the unity of mankind. It is not the kind of progress that even the upper classes claim to represent. Technological progress, for example, which is perhaps the ultimate form of progress that upper class people keep championing and use it as an excuse to maintain their privileges, is worthless without morality and equality among all men. And no, the claim that without class division there won't be any technological progress is bullshit and completely unfounded as a theory. It is just pure speculation. And even if it isn't, at best, all you can do with that is claim that class division was necessary in a certain period, but in the 19th century onward, there is clearly no more, the need for such a division. And so the truth that from now on, the only path is progress, and the only path to progress is towards the unity of mankind, cannot be ignored or even doubted. With what we have at our disposal now, that truth is affirmed whenever, whether unconsciously or consciously. So unconsciously means that with the establishing of means of communication, the telegraph, telephone, the press, and even the ever increasing availability of the goods of this world to all people, we are like conditioned to adopt the kind of behavior that corresponds to the ideal of unity. Like, even if we are not actively trying to reach universal unity, the fact that we use the media, the fact that we are increasingly living in abundance, that is going to make us believe independently of our will in a way that reflects unity. And consciously is the opposite, like we have things at our disposal that make us actively seek the unity of all men, like the destruction of superstitions that divide people by the spreading of the truths of knowledge and the expression of the ideals of the brotherhood of men in the best works of art of our time. But there's also another reason why that truth is affirmed again, and that is art. You see, as much as the upper classes try to replace art with a simulacrum, art, as Tolstoy says, remains a spiritual organ of human life and it cannot be destroyed. In other words, as long as there is human life, there are feelings. And if there are feelings, there are people to infect with those feelings, unless you are the last man on earth. And so if there are people to infect with feelings, then there will always be art. The spiritual organ of man is the organ, or let's say it's the immaterial organ that pushes us, that pushes man towards wanting to evolve for the better. And therefore the organ that compels him to seek the assistance of his fellow man. And art is that organ. Just like our heart is our organ that pumps blood, the organ of art has the function of pumping men towards one another, of bringing them together, to seek each other's company and each other's love. So it's an essential component of human life. And so quite strangely, after saying that true works of art are rare and good works of art that correspond to the ideal of Christianity are even rarer, Tolstoy flips it up completely and says this. He says, that is why, that is about, art being a spiritual organ. Despite all the efforts of the upper class people to conceal the religious ideal by which mankind lives, and that ideal is being recognized more and more by people and more often is being partially expressed by science and art amid our perverted society. Okay, so this isn't a contradiction with what we said earlier in the previous chapters, but simply that now, all of a sudden, the theory of art as being, a spiritual organ is gaining momentum. It's being recognized by more people in general, workers and peasants, like they're becoming more aware of it, both consciously and unconsciously, due to the progress in means of communication and science being more and more accessible. And that this truth is also being recognized by both scientists and artists. That's what he claims, at least. He says, more and more often, since the beginning of this century, there have appeared in literature and painting works of the highest religious art pervaded by the true Christian spirit, as well as works of popular everyday art accessible to all, so that art itself knows the true ideal of our time and is striving towards it. On the one hand, the best works of art are art of our time, convey feelings that draw towards the union and brotherhood of men, such are the works of Dickens, Hugo, Dostoevsky, in painting of Millet, Bastien Lepage, Jules Breton, L'Hermite, and others. And on the other hand, they strive to convey feelings not proper only to upper-class people, but such as may unite all men without exception. So funny that he mentions Bastien Lepage, because sure, he was a painter of popular and sentimental subjects, but got later attracted to Impressionism, which Tolstoy hated. But anyway, so according to him, there are more and more works of art expressing the religious consciousness of the time and the union and brotherhood of men. They are still rare, yes. He still says that such works are still few, but the need for them is already understood. And so he argues that art is being more and more accessible to the masses, slowly but surely. He says, besides that, in recent times, there have been more and more frequent attempts at popular editions of books and pictures, at generally accessible concerts and theaters. all this is still very far from what it ought to be, but one can already see the direction in which art is striving of itself in order to become, in order to come out of the proper, out on the proper path. So clearly, Tolstoy died before contemporary art, Marvel movies, Nickelback, and Justin Bieber. Yeah, I know he got through a lot, mistreated by his dad, and probably molested by P. Diddy. But you know, there's no such thing as a good celebrity. So none of them have anything in common with the religious consciousness that Tolstoy talks about. And they even managed to ruin the few things he's happy about, because eventually what got accessible to the masses that were excluded from art is precisely more counterfeits. So sorry to curb your enthusiasm, Leo, but I understand. We are still hopeful too that one day we will reach classless society, so we continue to believe in it, that today, you know, as much as back then, the religious consciousness of our time, which consists in recognizing the union of people as both the general and the individual aim of life, has already become sufficiently clear, and the people of our time now have only to reject the false theory of beauty according to which pleasure is recognized as the aim of art, and then religious consciousness will naturally become the guide of art in our time. So yeah, let's believe in that too. Let's keep pushing with the progress in the sciences and in communication, and put all of our resources in promoting the ideal of universal unity. I mean, no time besides ours, that of climate change, can make this, you know, more of a necessity. Check the podcast on Slow Down by Kohei Saito. So anyways, so Tolstoy predicts that soon enough, religious consciousness will become fully recognized by everyone one day. And when that day comes, there will be no counterfeit art anymore. And so art will totally regain its initial function. When that happens, the unity of men will be just a few steps away. And with a pure, good art aiming at that ideal, we will get there in no time. So first we dispense of bad art, and then get rid of counterfeit once and for all. He says, and as soon as religious consciousness, which unconsciously already guides the life of people in our time, is consciously recognized by people, the division of art into art of the lower and art of the upper classes will of itself immediately be annulled. Once there is a common brotherly art, then of itself there will be rejected, first that art which conveys feeling discordant with the religious consciousness of our time, feelings which do not unite but disunite people, and secondly that worthless, exclusive art which now occupies a significance for which it is unsuited. And as soon as this happens, art will immediately cease to be what it has been in recent times, a means of brutalizing and corrupting people, and will become what it always has been and should be, a means of mankind's movement towards unity and well-being. And of course, what a more poetic way to end this chapter than to compare modern treatment of art to the treatment of a woman forced into prostitution. He says, terrible as it may be to say it, what has happened to the art of our circle and time is the same as happens with a woman who sells her feminine attractions destined for motherhood for the pleasure of those who are tempted by such pleasures. Again, don't forget that Tolstoy is still, well, a man, but also a moral conservative. So of course, there is going to be that kind of misogyny that pretends that it's not misogyny, that it abhors when a woman is reduced to sexual pleasing object, but it itself reduces woman to motherhood. Like a woman who rents her body for sexual pleasure, that's disgusting. The only woman who isn't disgusting is a woman who becomes a mother. So yeah, falling right into that feminine mystique, aren't we? But let's pretend that by womanhood, he means its, you know, noble purpose. Let's try to be as generous as possible for the sake of the argument. So let's just say that art, instead of using its function destined for its, you know, for its higher purpose, the unity of men, is being used for the debased or the basest drives of humanity, the one that even blurs the difference between human beings and beasts. So he says, the art of our time, and circle has become a harlot. So that's the synonym of prostitute. And this comparison holds true in the smallest details. It is in the same way not limited in time, is always in fancy dress, is always for sale. It is just as alluring and pernicious. The genuine work of art can manifest itself in an artist's soul only rarely, as a fruit of all previous life, just as a child is conceived by its mother. Counterfeit art is produced by artisans and craftsmen continually as long as there are consumers. Genuine art has no need for dressing up, like the wife of a loving husband. Counterfeit art, like a prostitute, must always be decked out. So a woman doesn't have to be a wife or of a loving husband or a mother not to be a prostitute, Tolstoy. Okay, so chill, dude. But yeah, we get the comparison. That's commercial art, the culture industry right there. So art becomes a commodity, a prostitute, a body dressed up only to be consumed and for the basest of desires and the crudest of pleasures. So it isn't about the artist's feelings, it's not a seed that the artist plants in the hearts of others in which it grows, and as it grows it stretches its branches like arms and reaches for the branches of the artist and those consuming the same work of art. So that would be genuine art. So the true artist is also like a mother. So another sexist metaphor coming right up, he or she is driven by an impulse to make art, to infect others with their seeds, so more like a father, but who cares? So he wants to reproduce that feeling in others, and by doing so reproduces himself in others. But that movement towards others is a movement of love, since it is for the sake of a greater unity and entering into a communion founded on love, on divine love with others. So he's also compared to the mother whose sexual activity is caused by love. A mother conceives only out of love, apparently, not out of sexual lust. That would be a prostitute, but yeah, that's the metaphor. The artist doesn't give you pleasure, but love. He gives you feelings and unity with your brothers and sisters. So counterfeit art gives you only pleasure. Your relationship with it is just that of a client with a prostitute. Only pleasure counts. So he says, the cause of the appearance of genuine art is an inner need to express a stored up feeling, as love is the cause of sexual conception for a mother. The cause of counterfeit art is mercenary, just as with prostitution. The consequence of true art is the introduction of a new feeling into everyday life, as the consequence of a life's love is the birth of a new person into life. The consequence of counterfeit art is the corruption of men, the insatiability of pleasures, the weakness of men's spiritual force. This is what people of our time and circle must understand in order to get rid of the filthy stream of this depraved, lascivious art that is drowning us. So the metaphor is clear, though he could have chosen a better one, right? But anyway, so his point has been made, and so without further ado, let's finish this episode with the 19th chapter. So, chapter 19 is about what art in the future would look like, or how it ought to look like, because obviously it didn't evolve like Tolstoy hoped. Should we be happy with art's evolution or sad about it? Do you think that it's good that we didn't get the form of art that Tolstoy wished for? Well, let me know in the comments. But there's definitely a talk about what art is going to look like or where it's headed. The 19th century already saw an explosion in terms of style and artistic innovation with, so many schools. It's trying to come up with a new way to make artworks, and continued on in the 20th century. We had Impressionism, Pointillism, Cubism, Expressionism, Futurism, Dadaism, etc. In all kinds of arts, paintings, drama, music, architecture, poetry, everyone was challenging the traditional movements and techniques that were popular at the time. So everyone was excited about the possibilities, about what art, is going to be in the future. And especially refined new art, which is supposed to develop out of the art of one class of society now considered the highest art. And so this is the big issue. All those new movements, they all, they all pretend that there's such a thing as the highest art, right? And sure, Tolstoy doesn't deny this. There is an objective measure by which to evaluate art's progression. We can say that the art of period A is better than period B. However, this highest art that the upper classes are fighting over remains, well, an art of the upper classes, of one class of society. Sure, many artists and aestheticians are creating many new styles and techniques, each with distinct philosophies, if you will. But none of that matters. It doesn't matter that a branch of privileged white men fight over the true meaning of art within their own small circles when the majority of mankind doesn't have access to art. Whatever art they present as the peak of artistic expression remains exclusive, and therefore its value isn't judged by the unity of mankind, and hence it can never be truly the highest form of art. So such a new art of the future cannot and will not be, because it has parted with the chief demand of art, that it be guided by religious consciousness. So the highest form of art has to be an art that corresponds to religious consciousness of its time, at least, but that's not what the art of the upper classes of the Christian world is about. The Christian world has its own religious consciousness, which is the unity of mankind, and any art that doesn't reflect that consciousness is becoming more and more exclusive and therefore more and more perverted, and so has come to nothing. It has reached its dead end, and there is no going further on the path it has followed. So if there has to be an art of the future, because as we said, if the only alternative we are stuck with is the art of the upper classes, then it is better not to have art at all. Then that art will have to be in complete opposition to upper class art. It will not be a continuation of present-day art, but will emerge on completely different new principles, having nothing in common with those by which our modern upper-class art is guided. The art of the future, that is as much of art as will be singled out from the whole of art spread among mankind, will consist not in the conveying of feelings accessible only to some people of the wealthy classes, as happens now, but will be that art alone which realizes the highest religious consciousness of the people of our time. So yeah, that's what we've been arguing for. You know, that real good art, real good works of art, are those which convey feelings, drawing people towards brotherly union, or such all human feelings as will be able to unite all people. So that should be the only thing that can serve as a criterion to define art in the future, or at least good art. We've already insisted that bad art is also genuine art, and the only thing that makes art bad is the kind of feelings that it conveys. As long as it conveys feelings, it is art, but if those feelings contradict the religious consciousness of the time, it's going to be considered bad art. So when it comes to the art of the upper classes, it is either not art, since it doesn't convey feelings, or the worst possible art, since it conveys the worst feelings. But we don't just value art based on whether or not it is art. Like, evaluating art isn't about whether it conveys feelings or not. It's not evaluating but identifying something. So you need more than just, alright, that's art. You also need to say that it is good art. So in the future, only such art that promotes the unity of mankind will be singled out, allowed, approved, and disseminated. As for arts that convey feelings coming from obsolete religious teachings outlived by the people, even if these feelings make the works genuine works of art, they won't be tolerated. So feelings like found in church art, patriotic art, sensual art, meaning art that conveys the feelings of superstition, fear, pride, vanity, the admiration of heroes, art that arouses sensuality or an exclusive love of one's own nation, they won't be acceptable, and so such art will be regarded as bad, harmful, and will be condemned and despised by public opinion. So yes, this can be a problem if you take freedom of expression as highly important. He's literally kind of calling for censorship, though not from the state since he's an anarchist, but from the public. Although concretely speaking, it isn't clear what it would look like. Like how does public opinion express the condemnation of bad art? That what's certain is that such condemnation cannot be violent in any way, since Tolstoy himself champions non-violence, of even resisting the most authoritative and oppressive regimes. So it would be out of character, let's say, that when it comes to artists he retort to violent censorship. But keep in mind that he specifically targets harmful art, meaning art that promotes ideas that are contrary to the unity of mankind. So whatever works for the opposite of that unity is harmful, because causing disunity among human beings means that you are screwing someone over. So if someone finds themselves excluded from the rest of humanity, either they're being harmed or they are harming others. But you can also make art that is neither good or bad. It would be a mistake to think that only works of art that explicitly or even implicitly promote universal unity should be tolerated. Even the word tolerated or accepted isn't appropriate, so erase that. Good art should be promoted, praised, spread, but these are beyond mere toleration or acceptance. Art that is neither good nor bad, however, is just tolerated. That art would be an art that conveys feelings accessible only to some people, but none of those feelings bear a harmful content, that can be accepted. You can actually say that a lot of works in counterfeit art are like that. They're neither good nor bad, but they are accessible to only some people, and there is nothing wrong with that. The problem is that such works receive more praise than works of good art, works that promote the unity of mankind. So that's the problem with many counterfeit works of genuine works of art that are neither good nor bad. They become counterfeit once they receive more attention than good Christian works of art, and because they were they were produced using the methods of counterfeit art. So thus the right attitude to have towards these, let's call them neutral works, is that in the future they will be considered unimportant and will be neither condemned nor approved. But that also requires a classless society. You cannot say, we'll let the rich have their own, neutral works that are only accessible to them and leave good art to the masses. That won't be possible, since the rich are only capable of making their art the dominant art because they are rich. So that some circles have an art that is only accessible to them is conceivable, and it is possible, but not when those circles have the kind of power the upper classes possess. So no member of an upper class can accept that what is accessible to him only shouldn't be praised and valorized as the peak of what a human can produce. So for neutral art to be tolerated, it is crucial that those small groups of people hold no power over others or over the majority. And so this leads us to perhaps the most important aspect of good art. The art of the future, he says, will not be separated, will not be a separate class of rich people that appreciate art, but the whole people. So that for a work of art to be recognized as good, to be approved and disseminated, it will have to satisfy the demands, not of some people who live in identical and often unnatural conditions, but of all people, of the great mass of people who are in natural working conditions. So future art will be like this. First, it is art. Future art will be an art that can never be mistaken for something else, so no counterfeit. There would be no counterfeit in the future. Not that there will never be man-made works that don't convey feelings, but that those works won't be considered art. The problem with counterfeits is that it's not that they are not art, it's that they pretend to be so. So in the future, what we call art will always be genuine art and not something we take for art. And this future art is divided into three categories. You have good art, which is the most valuable and highest forms of art. It conveys feelings that correspond to the unity of mankind, and it is accessible to all people, so it is promoted. Then you have neutral art, so it doesn't contradict the unity of mankind, but it doesn't convey feelings to promote it either. So this is just tolerated, but it's not praised, it's not approved or disseminated. And it's, likely an art only accessible to few people. And then lastly, you have bad art, which explicitly or implicitly promotes feelings that are contrary to the unity of mankind. And this art is out to be despised, banished, and censored by everyone. Like, even those who have neutral art must also agree that bad art is harmful. And of course, they are also sensitive to good art as well, and know that good art ought to be promoted and disseminated. But this, configuration can only exist if there is no class division. So again, it's not let the rich have their own art and hopefully they will leave the rest of us, alone, the rest of the masses alone. No, there cannot be good or neutral art as long as there are social classes or class domination. There will only be bad art and it won't even be banished. So yeah, no class division is necessary. Even if you interpret the next paragraph as Tolstoy not calling for an abolition of classless society, his argument only makes sense in a classless society. So in the next paragraph he says, and the artists who produce art will no longer be, as now, only rare people from the wealthy classes or close to them, selected from a small portion of the whole people, but all the gifted representatives of the whole people who show a capacity for and an inclination towards artistic activity. So someone can interpret this as Tolstoy saying that the problem isn't that you have artists from wealthy classes, but that only them are allowed to make art. It would be conceivable to have a society in which there are artists from wealthy classes, but there'd be a minority of artists. Like, let all classes produce their artists, and given that the wealthy are a minority, you will end up with a majority of artists that aren't from the wealthy classes, but from those classes where we still exist within the natural conditions of labor. So you don't abolish the wealthy class, you just limit their power over art so that they don't get a monopoly on artistic creation. And even then, the next paragraph's first sentence can also be interpreted as such, that artistic activity will then be accessible to all people, but that wouldn't require the abolition of class society and of the wealthy classes. Art can become accessible to all, both to the rich and the poor, the idle and the worker. But that's, as we said, naive, since the art of the upper classes is only possible if there is a subjugation of the laboring classes, which leads them to work beyond exhaustion, to endless and mind-numbing exploitation, so much so that they don't even have the time or energy to produce art. For the art of the wealthy classes to become actually neutral, those classes must live ethically, without exploiting the masses, without reducing others like slaves, without seeing nothing higher than their pleasure, without fantasizing and romanticizing wars and sexuality. And if the wealthy classes cannot do those things, well, they cannot maintain the wealth that makes them, well then, the wealthy classes, and so they will collapse and disappear. So even exclusive art can only be tolerated in classless society. And also very important, the kind of art that is neutral still needs to be on principle accessible to everyone, because sure, in classless society people will work less than they do in class division, but they will still work, and so they will have the time to make true works of art, but not counterfeits. Because the wealthy aren't just, wealthy because they work their ass off laboring the fields or producing necessary goods or services for their communities, but they just spend their whole days idle. And so because of that and everything else that being in a wealthy class does to your brain and your mentality of constant competition and trying to be better than others, even people of your own circles and peers, If you are an artist, you're going to try to produce works that are better than those of others because you need the prestige. So you're going to spend much of your time trying to perfect your technique, and to the point where it doesn't even look like you have a skill, right? You don't, like, you look at a piece of contemporary art, for example, and you go like, well, my retarded nephew could have done that. And yet so much time and effort and energy is put in their work just to create the illusion of depth in the work. And if you can't afford that time, it means that you are pretty idle, that you are not working like the rest of society, which again, for Tolstoy, is the natural order of things. We have to work. It doesn't mean that work must be taxing on the body or seen as a torture, but like, Marx said, work must be, like working, actual work, must be attractive, creative, and actually helpful to others. But that cannot be if there is an idle class ripping everything, all the fruits of labor, just for themselves. So I just wanted to make that clear. Plus, giving that real good art is accessible to everyone, this includes the members of the wealthy classes. But how can they be sensitive to it if, one, they know nothing of the lives of the laboring masses, two, how can they be affected by it if they refuse to see their unethical lifestyle and the sacrifices the working classes must make in order to satisfy them? So those who want to keep some of neutral art must also acknowledge good art. And that acknowledgement is only possible if they are moved by good art. But to be able to be infected by good art, you cannot lead a life in which others are enslaved. So there cannot be class division. So in future art, Tolstoy says that the activity of art will first be accessible to everyone, not just to some sort of big brain elite, but to every single person. We explained that, for that to happen, we need a classless society. And Tolstoy gives 3 reasons why future art will be accessible to all, and it is related to what we just said, especially concerning time management. So the first reason is this. The art of the future will not require that complex technique which transfigures the works of art of our time and requires great effort and expenditure of time, but on the contrary will require clarity, simplicity, and brevity. Conditions acquired not by mechanical exercises, but by education of taste. So you can hardly see how the upper classes can accept this, that art be simple and clear. If it is the case, then it means that no one can dedicate their lifetime to the practice of art, and idle as they are, they see that as an insult. The second reason for why artistic activity will be accessible to all members of society is also related to this idea of time. If an activity is going to require years of training and practicing, it requires specialization and so professional schools. But since it is an activity accessible to everyone, from the smartest to the most simple, so to the simplest, it cannot have its own learning institution because it is not a specialty. Everyone can engage in art either as someone who makes it or consumes it. So instead of the existing professional schools accessible only to the few, in the people's primary schools, everyone will study music and painting, singing and drawing, together with reading and writing, so that each person having acquired the first principles of painting and music could, if he felt an ability and a calling for one of the arts, become perfected in it. So art is an activity that we can learn in primary schools, like how to count or how to read. There is no professional schools of reading and counting. Sure, there are schools for advanced mathematics, and that's because mathematics is an intellectual activity, which the more you get into, the more specialized and difficult it becomes. But art is not like that. It's not an intellectual, but an emotional activity, for a lack of a better word. Let's just call it emotional activity. It's about conveying feelings which precisely doesn't require any training to be able to convey it or get infected with it. And the last reason why future art is accessible to everyone is, thirdly, because all the forces now spent on false art will be employed in spreading true art among the whole people. So currently we do the opposite of this. So many efforts, resources, and money are spent on counterfeit art. And it will be naive to think that the upper classes will put in, their money for true good Christian art. And if they do, and we consider it genuine, it's only so that they do their part in abolishing their class privileges. Like, they use their fortune in a way to contribute to the realization of classless society. That will never happen, okay? They will never put their own resources, our resources that they, that we got dispossessed of, they will never put those resources to contributing to the abolition of class society. Anyways, now Tolstoy expects some objections, notably an objection to the claim that there won't be any special art schools. So many can object that without such schools, the technique of art will weaken. And you can even go as far as to say that the best way to protect the value of art is by having institutions that prevent anyone to proclaim themselves artists, and that way art will keep high standards. Indeed, without schools, there won't be any certified knowledge, or in this case, certified techniques, that you are an expert or skillful in art. And so anyone can start to claim that whatever shit they throw on a canvas or in a song is art. But that's exactly what Tolstoy is worrying about. And he says that's precisely what art schools are doing. They're not protecting the integrity of art. They are creating the conditions for there to be imposters, people who claim that they are artists when in fact they aren't. I mean, they can claim that they have some skills, as in, they know how to compose or paint. They know that by putting colors there or giving, a certain shade, they will manifest in the real world the images they have in mind and how to get a certain reaction from an audience. The problem is that's not how to define art. It's not a matter of skills. You can have all the skills in the world, all the techniques in all forms of art. That doesn't mean that you are making art. So yes, Tolstoy knows that without art schools, there will be less skills. So he knows that, art will undoubtedly weaken, but that's only if we define art by technique. And technique not in the sense of conveying feelings, but those complications of art which are now regarded as merits. So Tolstoy doesn't reject technique per se, but the kind of techniques that are taught in school arts, which aren't techniques for making art, but for counterfeit art. True art also requires skills, but those skills aren't the kind of skills that are proper to a small group of professionals. It's, again, like counting or reading. They are skills that should be available to everyone. Hence, the nature of the technique differs. For counterfeit, technicity is too demanding, and so where we think that demanding skills increase the quality and keeps us away from imposters, there are domains in which demanding skills do the opposite. For true art, however, technique is understood differently. It is not complexities, but clarity, beauty, simplicity, and economy in works of art. Funny how he puts beauty there. It also figures in Maude's translation, by the way, in the Bloomsbury edition, but it doesn't appear in the French edition. Instead, in French, it says la clarté, la simplicité et la sobriété, which literally means clarity, simplicity, and moderation, so economy in art. But it does appear in the original work in Russian. Tolstoy writes, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Yasnots, Krasoto. I'm not going to say simplicity because the word in Russian is just no. Okay, I'm going to try to say it. I think that's Niem no gaslosnost. I have no idea. I have no idea. And there's then another word that is word for moderation or conciseness or sobriety, which is Zatost. I don't know. I don't know how to pronounce these words. So sorry, but it means that you have clarity, beauty, krasato, and simplicity, which is the most complicated word I ever had to pronounce, and I'm not pronouncing it right. And then you have sobriety or moderation. So beauty is there, and it's weird, probably a mistake, or there he means something else, but I just follow the French version here and leave beauty out of it. So he says that if by technique we mean clarity, simplicity, and sobriety, then there is nothing to worry about concerning the quality of technique. On the contrary, technique will get better. Technique will be perfected if we leave these schools behind and focus on actual good art. As he says, technique not only will not weaken, as all popular art shows, but will be perfected 100 times over, even if there are no professional schools, even if the principles of drawing and music are not taught in people's schools. It will be perfected because all the artists of genius now hidden among the people will participate in art, and needing no complicated technique training as now, and having examples of true art before them, will give new examples of genuine art, which will be, as it has always been, the best school of technique for artists. Even now, every true artist learns not at school but from life, by the examples of the great masters. But when the most gifted from the whole people will be participants in art, and there will be more of these examples, and these examples will be more accessible than the school training, which future artists will be deprived of, will be compensated for 100 times over by the training the artist gets from the numerous examples of good art spread through society. So that's the first difference between future and present art. Future art will be an art that requires no specialty, no lifetime of training. So it's an art that doesn't come from special schools, but from everyday life. And for that reason, future art will be better in quality than counterfeits. And this leads us to the second difference, that future art is an art by the people, to and for the people. Artists will actually have more resources at their disposal than all the money that the upper classes pump from the labor of the masses to make their art. Because the prime resource for art is feelings. And as artists come from the masses, they come loaded with feelings. And here technique will serve no other purpose but spreading those feelings, and thereby infecting more and more people until the unity of all mankind becomes a reality. So this second difference will be that the art of the future will not be produced by professional artists who are remunerated for their art and who are occupied with nothing else but their art. The art of the future will be produced by all the people who will occupy themselves with it whenever they feel a need for such activity. So here we need to address something important. And it also relates to that last point about doing art when we feel a need for it. So that is again, about time management. Some people, from the upper classes of course, can still object that Tolstoy is still naive by appealing to the widespread opinion that an artist will work better, will do more if he is materially secure. But this opinion to Tolstoy does nothing but proving once again that what is regarded as art among us is not art but is merely a simulacrum of it. If you think that an artist, in order to produce good art, needs to be materially secure, then for you, real art is counterfeit. Let's explain. Given that artists, in Tolstoy's view, should be among the masses, then the artist also needs to be a worker. Artists aren't just artists, but they are also, laborers. They can be peasants, artisans, workers, etc. And that is their main activity. They shall provide, like everyone else, the means of subsistence. And as such, they cannot have material security. That is, they cannot have a guarantee that they will never have to worry about the basic necessity, because for them to dedicate their lives to only art making, that means that some other people are working to provide for them those necessities. All they have to do is just sell their work to exchange that money for what they need, and usually for more than what they need. Being part of the upper classes, most of the money spent is spent on luxuries, not even necessities. And as such, Tolstoy prohibits any remuneration for being an art making. Since, making art, an activity done in exchange for money, is making art insincere. So artists actually become compelled to make art and are not free to do so. They make art not because they have the need to do it, as in they don't do it because they have feelings to share, but because they must pay their rent, their food, their luxurious expenses, etc. I mean, even the artists who struggle financially aren't making art for the sake of human progress, for the unity of people, but simply because they must do so in order to survive economically. So in both cases, whether the artist actually has material security, he's no longer a man of the people, since, the people must work in order to provide him with that material security. All he has, to worry about is just get the money to exchange it. So if he has it, he's still a professional artist. It's not like he's going to use his free time for working in the field or on the machine. And if he's struggling financially, he's still not a man of the people, since he's cut off from them, and none of their lives are actually reflected in his works, meaning that they, the people, cannot be infected by his art, which wasn't his goal in the first place. So his goal is to sell his art. So no, to avoid counterfeits, artists cannot get material security, but must also be providers for themselves and others like everyone else. We all work to secure our needs, but also those of others. And there is no reason why some provide while others only rip off the benefits. And no, this isn't an argument against the poor or illegal immigrants, but the upper classes only. So let's talk about the notion of need here. Tolstoy isn't rejecting productivity. He's not saying that we cannot produce efficiently, since a raise in productivity means that you produce more but with lesser effort, and hopefully with lesser resources for ecological purposes. But if we argue that we need productivity, then not everyone can be required to work long hours. Given that with higher productivity there will be higher surpluses, and so there won't be a need to work as hard as, or as long. So there will be a fair amount of time for leisure activities, and Tolstoy embraces this. He embraces technological progress and the production processes like the division of labor. So he's not condemning you into a life of constant and endless work, a life of poverty and exhaustion. He says concerning the division of labor that it is very advantageous for the production of boots or bread that a shoemaker or a baker who has no need to prepare dinner or chop wood for himself will make more boots or bread than if he has to see his dinner and firewood himself. In other words, Tolstoy argues that when it comes to bare necessities, we actually don't have to produce them only according to our needs. If we increase productivity, collectively of course, we will be producing goods and services not for ourselves only, but also for others. A shoemaker doesn't just make shoes for himself, but also for others. So their labor is also done to satisfy my needs, but also those of others, and therefore there will be a surplus. Physical labor is a labor that can afford and has to afford going beyond needs. It is an activity that also anticipates future or possible needs. I produce enough food rapidly, but now I don't need that much, so I leave some of it for another time or for others, so that we don't have to work as much again. So this is pretty simple and straightforward. But when it comes to art making, it's not the same thing. While handicraft can be done when there is no need for it, art, which is not a handicraft, but the conveying of a feeling experienced by the artist, can only occur when there is a need for it. Like right now, I feel a certain need, like I feel a certain feeling, let's say, and I have to go share it. In other words, producing food can be done when we are not hungry, when we are not yearning for food. But art is produced only when we are hungry for it, meaning when we have a feeling to convey. And so for that reason, it cannot be remunerated, because paying someone to do something means that first, you're the one who has the need, not the person who is going to do the activity. So, the activity, the artist doesn't have the need to make art when you pay them. And two, if it is remunerated, then it can only be produced in exchange of money, and therefore it becomes produced on demand. But as such, it won't be sincere, and it will lose its essence and identity as art. As Tolstoy says, you cannot produce feelings simply because you pay an artist for making a painting. He says feelings can be born in a man only if he lives the many-sided life natural and proper for human beings. That is, a life of engaging with others, with the masses, and so the laborers. Feelings are found in a man who lives in a dynamic environment, where there are countless experiences, and such experiences are provided to him through two things: nature and society, the natural world with its resources and fellow non-human beings, and the company of his fellow human beings. Men need to be embedded in these two things, and the way they immerse themselves in nature and society is through work. If there is material security, there is no work anymore. And no, raising productivity isn't material security, but to make work attractive, as Marx said, and Tolstoy apparently agrees on this. So we welcome technology not to be released from work, but to work even better and therefore enhance our pool of feelings. Without work, man is cut off from nature and others, and so the quality and range of his feelings decrease. And as they decrease, the quality of art decreases too. He says, and that is why giving artists security in their material needs is the most harmful condition for artistic productivity, because it releases the artist from the condition proper to all men of struggling with nature to support his own and other people's lives, and thereby deprives him of the occasion and the possibility of experiencing the most important feelings proper to human beings. No situation is more harmful for artistic productivity than the situation of complete security and luxury in which artists usually live in our society. So, no material security. And as we said, this isn't to take away leisure or the opportunity to embrace noble activities, especially intellectual and artistic ones. This isn't, making people constantly worried about having shelter or food. Instead, it's about providing reasons for people to labor and see labor as attractive, not as a curse, but as a blessing. And for that, an artist must never, like he is now, cut himself off from the ordinary life of humans, meaning cutting themselves off from labor. So the essence of humans is precisely to work. If the artist is also human, then he too must work. And in this sense, it is crucial that he works because he has an enormous responsibility that is contributing to the unity of mankind. Without artists, religious consciousness fades and withers. And so it is imperative that the artist of the future will live the ordinary life of a human being, earning his living by some kind of labor. Again, this doesn't mean working to exhaustion, so much so that when you leave work, your body and mind are numb and only pleasure can give them back a sense of vitality. You still have plenty of time to engage in leisure activities, and we're not degrading such activities since they too contribute as much as labor to the progress of mankind. It's because of leisure that we can develop intellectual capacities and also our artistic faculties. And given how important art is for Tolstoy, it's necessary that artists have the necessary time to produce art. So it's not about toiling to exhaustion, sickness and death, but to live the human experience fully, in all of its aspects and sides. It's important that the artist lives the life of ordinary people, and so the most experiences of humanity, because his job is precisely to share the feelings we get from human experiences and thus uniting the rest of humanity. So as Tolstoy says, the artist will strive to give the fruit of that supreme spiritual force which passes through him to the greatest number of people, because this conveying of the feelings that have been born in him to the greatest number of people is his joy and his reward. The artist of the future will not even understand how it is possible for an artist whose joy consists in the widest dissemination of his works to give these works only in exchange for a certain payment. Until the sellers are driven out of the temple of art will not be a temple. The art of the future will drive them out. So that's the famous story of Christ casting out of all the money chargers that sold and bought in the temple. You find the story in all of the four Gospels, in Matthew, so I think Matthew 20-21, 12-13, Mark 11, 15-17, Luke 19, 45-46, and John 2, 14-17. So you know the story, Jesus went to the temple of Jerusalem where he found merchants and money chargers, exchangers of coins and money. So the merchants were selling doves, cattle, and sheep. In Tolstoy, they represent the aestheticians, the upper-class artists, the specialized art teachers, the critics, the art lovers, etc. So everyone that contribute to counterfeit art and are turning art into a commodity, into a market. And so Jesus chased the merchants and money chargers from the temple with a whip, overturned their tables, prohibited carrying merchandise in the temple, and said to them that the temple, the house of God, is a house of prayer for all nations, not a den of robbers. So the temple of art is the house of art, a house of infectiousness and feelings and unity, not a den of counterfeits, not a den of patriots, of hedonists and narcissists. In short, the house of art isn't a specialized art school. So future art shall be an art whose temple is cleansed from all that shit. And so now, after addressing the conditions in which true good art that corresponds to today's religious consciousness, we move to the content of the art of the future. So obviously the content will be completely unlike that of present-day art. Again, here it's unclear whether present-day art is genuine art or not, but let's grant that here it's not talking about counterfeit as simulacra, but about bad art, so the worst art. So this art isn't devoid of feelings, so it makes it genuine art, but it only consists in the expression of exclusive feelings, making it the worst possible art since all civilizations before, none of them had a religious consciousness that values exclusively exclusive feelings. All nations and civilizations promote an art of unity to some degree, but in the present day art, there is no unity whatsoever. The only semblance of it is in nationalist or patriotic art, but as we said, is just a semblance of unity, since it is more predicated on the hatred and exclusion of others rather than on the love of thy neighbor. And even more alarmingly, no previous civilization adopted an art that doesn't correspond to the religious consciousness of its time, meaning an art that isn't accessible to every member of that civilization. So the exclusive feelings in present-day art include vanity, tedium, satiety, and sensuality in all possible forms, accessible and interesting only to people who have forcibly liberated themselves from the labor proper to human beings. And by contrast, the content of future art is threefold. Will consist in the expression of feelings experienced by a man who lives a life proper to all people and coming from the religious consciousness of our time, or feelings accessible to all people without exception. So we have feelings experienced by common people, life proper to all people, and 2, feelings coming from the religious consciousness of our time, and 3, accessible to all. So the bias of the people of Tolstoy's circle, the upper classes, who do not or cannot or do not wish to know the feelings that must make up the content of art of the future, is that for them, such an art as promoted by Tolstoy cannot be rich in content, since they confuse complexity with richness. And art that should express feelings common and accessible to all, literally popular art, is weak. There's nothing interested about it, and is just a promotion of mediocrity. And so to them, to the upper classes, true art's content is very poor in comparison to the subtleties of the exclusive art with which they are now occupied. Let's say, quite rhetorically and sarcastically, what new can be expressed in the sphere of Christian feelings or love of one's neighbor? And the feelings accessible to all people are so insignificant and monotonous. And yet for Tolstoy, if there is an art that is rich and filled with diversity of feelings that long to be expressed, is precisely popular art. And sure, you can say, but how can you speak of diversity and novelty when the feelings you express are literally common and therefore known to everyone? All popular art, for the upper classes, is just repeating what everyone already knows, and so it has to be simple and so mediocre. But this is where they are wrong. We already addressed this issue last week when we talked about how feelings that are common and simple can nonetheless become new. Think again of the example of the boy telling the story of the wolf. Yes, you experienced fear before, so you know fear, but have you experienced the specific fear of a boy, of that boy alone and lost in a forest and came across a wolf? No, that's completely a new feeling. But being simple, it hits you directly. You need to do nothing to feel it. You, as you already are, manifest no resistance to it. It's like you are finely tuned to that feeling, and therefore, despite being a new feeling, it's like you have known all your life, giving how easy your entire being reacts to it. But Christian popular art does the same thing, but goes even further. Sure, you know many of the feelings that Christian art takes as its content, sure. But by experiencing them from a Christian point of view, you actually get new feelings. And the thing about the Christian version of familiar feelings is that they never exhaust their novelty, precisely because they never exhaust their inclusivity. Feeling through Christian art is like falling in love with your partner every day. You may do the same things every day, have a routine, know each other's interest, have no mystery for one another, even anticipate each other's reaction, etc. And yet you never get bored because each time it feels like a new love. As he says, and yet in our time the only feelings that can truly be new are religious, Christian feelings, or feelings accessible to all. The feelings that come from the religious consciousness of our time, Christian feelings, are infinitely new and varied. Only not as some think in the sense of portraying Christ and episodes from the Gospels, or repeating in new form the Christian truths of unity, brotherhood, equality, and love. That's church Christian art. But in the sense that all the oldest, most ordinary phenomena of life, long known from all sides, call up the newest, most unexpected and touching feelings as soon as one regards them from a Christian point of view. What can be older than the relations between spouses or parents to children, of children to parents, the relations of people to their compatriots, of foreigners to attack, defense, property, land, animals? But as soon as one regards these phenomena from a Christian point of view, there at once arise the most new, complex, touching, and infinitely varied feelings. So, Christian art, the true good art of the time, isn't going to introduce feelings that you cannot classify within the range of feelings that you already know. It's going to give you the same feelings: fear, love, compassion, sadness, joy, anger, but because those feelings, when experienced within a true Christian framework, are now moving you towards the unity of mankind, they become constantly new. You know love, yes, but loving thy neighbor in the sense that Jesus meant is always going to be new. And so what we have with Christian art is not a narrowing like the upper class suspects, but a broadening of the area of the content for the art of the future, which will convey the most simple everyday feelings accessible to all. So future art will not be exclusive but infinitely inclusive, to the point where even the simplest child can be infected by it. This, for the upper classes, is seen as an insult, because if your art can even be understood by children, then your art is poor, is stupid. But that's their mistake. Art isn't supposed to be an intellectual, sophisticated activity that only a few people with some sort of proper training can grasp. As Tolstoy says, in our former art, what was considered worthy of being conveyed in art was only the expression of feelings proper to a certain exclusive position, and that only on condition that they be conveyed in a most refined way, inaccessible to the majority of people. But the whole enormous realm of popular children's art, jokes, proverbs, riddles, songs, dances, children's games, mimicry, was not considered a worthy object of art. The artist of the future will understand that to invent a little tale, a touching song, a ditty, a short, simple, and often catchy little song or poem intended to be sung, an amusing riddle, a funny joke, to make a drawing that will give joy to dozens of generations or to millions of children and adults, is incomparably more important and fruitful than to write a novel or a symphony or paint a picture that will for a short time divert a few members of the wealthy classes and then be forgotten forever. The realm of this art of simple feelings, accessible to all, is enormous and as yet almost untouched. So Tolstoy also includes his own novels here, but you can say that his works haven't gone forgotten yet, but that's only because they are saved by the canon. There are countless works produced by other novelists as talented and skilled as Tolstoy, but whose works were eventually forgotten. They amused their circles for a bit and then disappeared. The works preserved in the canon simply serve as exemplars, as ideas in kind of the Platonic sense of counterfeits. And so the reason why Tolstoy's War and Peace or Anna Karenina is remembered, it's not for its feelings actually, but simply so that literature majors study it. It's just an exemplar of counterfeit. Like, if you want to be a part of the high society of good taste, you need to know these works. But they have no more merit than the works that, we have forgotten or don't study in art or literary schools. So moving on. Thus, he says, the art of the future will not only not be impoverished, but on the contrary, will be infinitely enriched in content. In just the same way, the form of art of the future will not only not be inferior to the present-day form of art, but will be incomparably superior. Superior not in the sense of refined and complex technique, but in the sense of the skill of brevity, simply and clearly conveying without any superfluities the feeling that the artist has experienced and wishes to convey. And that's actually harder to do. Like, believe it or not, learning a technique, that's easy, even if you spend a life practicing it or perfecting it. If art is reducible to just technicity, then everyone can do it. But harnessing the skills of conciseness, simplicity and clarity, that's a whole other thing. Tolstoy gives the following anecdote. He had a talk with a famous astronomer, though he doesn't name him and I don't find a version that identified who that astronomer was. So the astronomer just gave public lectures on the spectral analysis of the stars of the Milky Way. It's about, what stars are made of, how hot they are, how fast they move, and even how they evolve over time by analyzing the light that comes from them. So it's called spectroscopy, meaning studying the light coming from stars by splitting it into its component colors, so its spectrum, much like a prism creates a rainbow. And depending on where the light fits in that spectrum, you can identify the chemical components of the light, because each element, like hydrogen, helium, or iron, absorbs or emits light at specific wavelengths. You can also identify the temperature of the star. If it's blue, it is very hot, and if it's red, it's cooler. You can also know its movement, whether it's moving away from us or closer to us. You can even know its density, etc. And so Tolstoy told this astronomer that all of this is great, but what a good thing it would be if he, with his knowledge and skill, would give a public lecture in cosmography, touching only on the most familiar movements of the Earth, because among the listeners to his lectures on the spectral analysis of the stars in the Milky Way, there were certainly many people, especially women, who did not quite know why there are day and night, winter and summer. So Tolstoy was like, there are many people who don't even know why there are day and night or the seasons, and especially women, since women are the most illiterate people of Russia at that time. And so they were the ones who were denied education most, who struggled to get an education. So they don't even know these basic things like why is there day and night, why there are the seasons. And so it would be better to give lectures accessible to those before jumping into spectroscopy. But then the wise astronomer replied with a smile, yes, that would be a very good thing, but it is very difficult. To lecture on the spectral analysis of the Milky Way is much easier. Like, spectroscopy is actually easier to teach and explain than why there are seasons. And so he continues, it is the same in art. To write a long poem about the time of Cleopatra, or paint a picture of Nero burning Rome, or compose a symphony in the spirits of Brahms or Richard Strauss, or an opera in the spirit of Wagner, is much easier than to tell a simple story without any superfluities, and at the same time in such a way that it conveys the narrator's feelings, or to pencil a drawing that would touch the beholder or make him laugh, or to write 4 measures of a simple clear melody that would convey a mood and be remembered by its listeners. So this, of course, the upper classes cannot understand, and they even keep trying to come up with all kinds of excuses to keep the art that reaffirms their social domination. Now they talk that it is impossible for us now with our development to return to primitive ways, says the artists of our time. It is impossible for us to write such stories as the story of Joseph the Dreamer or the Odyssey, to make such statues as the Venus of Milo, to write such music as folk songs. So this is funny because they spend their whole career trying to imitate those works, and now they say, we cannot go back to them. All of a sudden, doing the kind of art that was the norm in all human civilization, an art that corresponds to the religious consciousness of the time, becomes impossible. And so they finally admit that this upper-class art was never a demanding art, but was just the easiest way to make art. And you know what? They're right. Doing an art according to religious consciousness is impossible for them. And Tolstoy agrees, but that's his point. For the artist of our time, it is indeed impossible. However, it becomes perfectly possible for the artist of the future, who will not know all the depravity of technical improvements, concealing the absence of content, and who, not being a professional artist and getting no remuneration for his activity, will produce art only when he feels an irrepressible inner need. So there, what makes it impossible is just the conditions that favor counterfeits. But take away those conditions and nothing can be more possible than an art that is true, good and genuine. An art that is accessible to all and richer than all the counterfeits combined and aims at the universal brotherhood of men. And with this, we end the episode on future art with a summary of what future art will look like. Quote, thus, the art of the future will be completely different from what is now considered art, both in content and in form. The content of the art of the future will be only those feelings that draw people towards union or already unite them. As for the form of this art, it will be accessible to everyone, and therefore the ideal of perfection in the future will be not the exclusiveness of a feeling accessible only to some, but on the contrary, its universality. And in form, it will be not cumbersomeness, obscurity, and complexity, as it is now considered, but on the contrary, brevity, clarity, and simplicity of expression. And only when art becomes like that will it cease to distract and corrupt people. So it does now, calling for the expenditure of their best forces and become what it should be, a means of transferring Christian religious consciousness from the realm of mind and reason to the realm of feeling, and thereby bringing people closer in practice in life itself to the perfection and unity indicated to them by religious consciousness. So next week we will read the conclusion, and that will be it for Tolstoy.